One of the few good things about the multiplayer side of Assetto Corsa right now is that it forces you to jump on many cars looking for the best possible race. You see what lobbies are hot at the time and just jumping. Most of the time that involves GT3 cars, so it was about time to release a tune for one of these. My car of choice was the McLaren 650S. It isn't my favorite of the bunch. I like how the Audi R8 looks much better, but this one drives good out of the box, so over time I found myself coming back to it. Before sharing this setup, I want to make a long series of disclaimers. The work to create this is much harder than in the Project Cars days, and I don't mean the cars are harder to set up in Assetto Corsa, it is about many other things. First, the game is being constantly updated. Every update changes some stuff, and renders some part of the tune useless. As an example, my Sauber C9 tune damper values don't even exist anymore. I have also made some changes in the Lotus Exos tune since I uploaded it. Second, I lack references to check the quality of the tunes. There are no leaderboards and I have no clue how close to the world record pace I am, so the best I can do now is to work on the car until I feel it's not easy to make further progress. My tunes were never aimed to be the fastest over one lap, but it was helpful for me to see where I was in terms of absolute pace. So, to create this, I just focus on one thing. I try to find a setup that gets the car driving well in many tracks and is suitable to use in long runs too. It is hard to tell how good your pace is in this game. The lap times I get now are much slower than before 1.09 update, but I get the same kind of results. In race pace, I'm usually doing mid-203s around Silverstone, which is where most of the setup work was done. A good qualifying lap on new tires with low fuel should be a mid-202 with a grippy track. Now, let's get going with the driving tips. The thing that sets apart this car from others is how easy it is to get out of corners. The car is able to rotate really easily and still get perfect traction, so it allows you to get very early and very hard on the power. On long corners with constant radius, it is very satisfying to power out like a rocket. Going into corners where you need to brake and turn, this tendency to rotate becomes a bit of a problem. There's always this slight oversteer forcing you to use a bit of throttle to keep the car pointing forward. It becomes really obvious on the last two corners before the old Silverstone finish straight. You are so close to the limit of the rear that even a poorly timed downshift can send you around. So you have to make a choice. You can dial it out and lose on agility, or deal with it and use the throttle mid-corner to stay safe. I'll tell you later what items I changed to deal with this. Silverstone is famous for the front left tire overheating, but you can see I managed to stay quite safe with this tune and my own driving. The fastest laps of the race often come in the final laps, so a bullseye tire wear is excellent for me. Nürburgring is another track where I have raced quite often, so I know pretty well what pace I can do. I'm usually lapping in the high 157s for race pace, with a high 156 being possible in a good qualifying lap. Again, my pace barely drops in the final laps at all. This lap is a good example on the throttle used to avoid oversteer mid-corner. I normally like to brake once and accelerate once, but in many corners you'll see me having to use a small throttle input way before corner exit just to keep the car going forward. As for the braking, I completely ignore the car has ABS and just modulate the braking normally. If it turns on to help me, I don't mind, but I try to minimize the interference. I don't stomp the pedal and let it do all the work. I don't recommend aggressive downshifting in this car. If you are trail braking very deep and maximizing the braking area properly, a bad shift is going to upset the rear. In long, straight line braking zones you can get away with more reps down the gears, but it doesn't seem to help much reducing the braking distances. The car is fantastic at riding curves, and it takes quite a lot of punishment even with a low ride height. The only potential problem is touching an inside curb with the rear end of the car on the limit of grip. That can force a correction or two, like here. Any curve that is not high enough to send the front flying is going to help you turning the car even more, so keep that in mind. On traction, the car sails over the curves easily, as long as the rear end is already loaded. The power curve of this car is just brilliant. It delivers all around the rev range, so there's not much of a point squeezing the very last revs before shifting up, or in taking corners in a very low gear. Alright, so that's it for the driving tips. Let's end this lap and see the tune already. Brake bias is one of the key parts of the tune. The end of braking zones is one area where this car is tricky, and the default value takes that into account. It comes at 70-30, and it is quite safe that way. I move it back a little bit. If you like stomping the brake pedal, it is safer to keep the original front heavy bias. On the aero screen, the most surprising thing for me is how little winds help. High values give a bit of extra grip, but they're like a parachute down the straights. For a track like Silverstone, with a combination of fast corners and long straights, I use 1.5. For Nürburgring or Brands Hatch, 1.7 or 8 is better suited. Don't hesitate to go a click up at the rear if it helps you getting rid of excessive oversteer. Don't remove that click at the front spoiler unless it's Monza and you are running something very skinny at the rear too. For the gearing, don't be obsessed with squeezing every rev in the end of the longest straight. The main thing is to avoid having to shift in tricky places, so keep an eye on corners when one gear seems too long and another one too short, and fix that stuff. The power diff setting is perfect at default. It works wonders in combination with a moderate traction control setting. If you are going to drive without TC, you'll probably want to lower this value a couple of clicks. If you are going to keep it on, leave it at 65. At first, it's hard to adapt to how much you can push out of corners. It always seems you are about to spin, but the car keeps going where you want and still gathering speed easily. I changed the coast value between 55 and 65 depending on the track. The higher the value, the easier it is to handle oversteer in the very final part of the braking zones. If there are many curved braking zones, I'll use a slightly higher value. If the track layout allows me to brake in a straight line, I'll take all the rotation I can get and leave the value a bit lower. Right now, 25 psi works okay for cold pressures. You'll always land around 33 psi once you are running, and that's the ideal value right now in the console build. This has already changed in the PC version, so expect lower values to be better in the next update. I read somewhere the new ideal hot pressures are around 26 psi. I leave the camber values at default. The temperature spread is perfect after long runs, with around 10 degrees of difference between the hottest and the coldest part of the tire. I get very low wear levels too, so I prefer not messing here. The rear value might look high, but the car keeps insane traction anyway, so don't try to fix what is not broken. Same for toe, I saw no reason to touch it. I haven't explored this area at all, so you can try some changes here if you are looking for leaderboard times or one lap speed. The default alignment settings seem to be really good for long runs in the soft compound, so I'm keeping these values. For ride height, you can go really low without getting into trouble. The minimum values still keep the car away from the ground almost all the time once the tires are up to pressure, so I stay very close to them. I keep the rake slightly over 1 cm, similar to the default level. Be careful about going straight to the lowest values in every car though, I have had bad experience with this in Assetto Corsa. The springs are nearly default. I just increased one click the front values trying to minimize the oversteer on corner entry. This is something you can probably ignore if the track doesn't have tricky curved braking zones. The default value still keeps the car away from the ground easily, and the front works a bit better too. If you think you can use the extra front grip without being in the car, stay lower. On the sway bars I did the opposite. I softened the front one a little bit. Once you are completely off the brakes, the car is much less tricky, so in long lateral efforts like turn 3 at Barcelona, you can get away with a very strong front end with no problem. One thing I didn't experiment with is to move up both levels together, trying to keep similar balance while reducing the amount of body roll. I think it's worth to try yourself and see the results. And finally, these are my damper values. I barely did anything here. I used a slightly stiffer front damping without going too far away from default. The idea was to make the car less tricky on turning and riding inside curves, and I didn't seem to get any unwanted understeer, so I kept them this way. I also left the travel range alone. I was tempted to try lower values, but the car was never touching down and it was more than responsive enough. That's it. I hope you can use this to your advantage if this is your GT3 of choice, and I hope the next update doesn't turn the setup into utter rubbish. Also remember about the ideal pressure changes if you are playing the PC version, and keep in mind they will probably change soon in consoles too. Thanks for watching.